20 years ago, after months of diplomatic wrangling at the United Nations, a US-led coalition with Britain as a senior partner invaded Iraq. The opening salvos against Baghdad were described as shock and awe. The so-called coalition of the willing claimed it wanted to remove Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, change the regime and spread democracy to the Middle East. So what happened? Welcome to the program. I'm Philip Hampsheir. President George W. Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair justified the Iraq war by saying Saddam's biological and nuclear weapons posed an imminent danger. Their main European allies were always skeptical. Ultimately, those WMDs were never found, and Iraq descended into chaos.
The image of Saddam's statue being toppled in central Baghdad became the symbol of the US military victory in Iraq. It took just 3 weeks for coalition forces to capture the country's major cities, and American officials declared victory.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. Because of you, our nation is more secure. Because of you, the tyrant has fallen and Iraq is free.
But the post-war plans were woefully inadequate, and turning Iraq into a thriving democracy was beyond the foreign administration. Instead, the outcome was insurgency, civil war, and terrorism. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives in the chaos. From the start, the invasion of Iraq was an effort led by politicians, mainly from the UK and the US, not the general public. In Britain, over 1 million people took to the streets in London in an attempt to stop the war. The French and German governments refused to support the invasion. And even in the United States, the war quickly lost popular support throughout the 2000s. After 8 years, Washington cut its losses, and officially, the last US soldiers left Iraq in 2011.
So joining us to discuss the Iraq War and its legacy 2 decades on, in Boston, Massachusetts, we're joined by Abdulrazzaq Al-Saiedi. He's a researcher and journalist who covered the war in Iraq for the New York Times. Meanwhile, in Zurich, we have Richard Toye, Professor of Modern History at the University of Exeter. And in London, we have Oula Kadhum, who is a postdoctoral fellow in Lund University and fellow in international migration at the LSE. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Abdulrazzaq, if I can start with you, please. You've obviously spent a lot of time in Iraq over the course of the last 2 decades. So how is it now versus how it was 20 years ago? Is it better or worse?
Oh, that's really the tougher question. In fact, in the March 20th in Iraq time, which is 19th in the US time, in fact, was the end of an era and the start of a new era. And it was the latest in a series of disturbing events. As you know, Iraq has experienced about 7 coups and revolutions in the last century. But this latest one in 2003, it changed our life drastically.
How has it changed it? Has it changed it for the better or for the worse?
I mean, at some to the better and some to the worse. So let's have some facts. Let's have some factuals here. We were freed from a vicious, brutal dictator. Life in Iraq during the Saddam regime was unbearable. And also there was no hope because Saddam was prepared to transfer the power to his family, to his son. So I am, as a young man, lived all my life in Iraq, and I born at the same year that Saddam Hussein seized power, and I grew up with war, violence, oppressions, and then sanctions, and then violence, and it's a cycle. And we were Iraqis at that time. We said, how that could be ended? It looks like, at that time, it looked like it's going to go forever. So we were free, that's true. And this is the first time we enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of media, freedom to protest. we were liberated. That's also true. But there's a big difference about what we hoped for and what we actually got. So we might get our freedom, but we lost our national identity. So the cost was very, very high in order to get, this freedom. So we thought by the end of Saddam, we're going to see the end of the fear and oppression and atrocity. But in fact, it's a new kind of violence, a new kind of fear. It's just started after 2003, and it's mainly committed by non-state actor, this is unusual, because usually we were oppressed by the government. But then when we saw it's a weak government, but the non-state actor are more stronger. So I've been asked this question, would be better off or something. I know the US has an excellent plan to defeat Saddam. They defeated him only within 3 weeks. They get him off his palace, this is really incredible. However, the problem is with the post-war plan. In fact, there was very poorly planned. It took US 2 years to invade Germany in World War II, but it took them 2 months to invade Iraq. We thought, as a naive and about Iraq, that the US were going to fix a lot of problems, but they create many problems. So,
well, let me come back and ask you. Hold on, Abdulrazzaq. Let me come back and ask you about those problems in just a second. Let me pass it on to Oula. Oula, I saw you nodding there. There were a lot of, if you like, I think the best way to put this is, did the US win the war but lose the peace?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's always this comparison between pre-2003 Iraq and post-2003. Was it better under Saddam? Was it better in post-2003? These binaries, as though these were the only options that we had as Iraqis in terms of regime change. Well, this is deeply problematic. It's like comparing two authoritarianism and saying which one is better. And on the question of, was it better? Better for who? We have to ask, was it better for the diasporic elite who returned to Iraq and who've been governing ever since in a corrupt system? Has it been better for the working class Iraqis who are still suffering with no basic services, no electricity, clean water, who are living on government subsidies? Has it been better for religious minorities who've been peripheralized in the political system under muhassasa ta'ifiyya and who have had to emigrate forcibly out of Iraq, changing Iraq's demographic? Who has it been better for? I think this is a key question.
Richard, let me come across to you. Your perspective on this is more of the angle of how the situation affected the UK and Europe. It did have an impact on UK, US, European, Canadian politics too, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And this was a fundamental moment in British politics. I suppose one might say that the events of 9/11 had been a precursor to that change. But certainly it was one of the most intensely debated wars at the time, and it continued to have a long aftermath, in part because of the sense of distrust of politicians that was generated, particularly in Britain, in relation to the fact that they turned out not to be the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which the British government had confidently said existed.
Ola, if I come back to you, what do you think Iraqis feel about their country's prospects now versus how they felt about their country's prospects after the Americans had completed their invasion?
Well, I think you'd have to ask Iraqis about that in the first place. I mean, the Iraqis inside the country is a better place to answer that question than I am. Suffice it to say that the Tishreen movement that we've seen, the October movement that we've seen more recently in 2019, where Iraqis of all backgrounds have come out on the street to protest against the legacy of the intervention, against muhassasa ta'ifiyya, against the endemic corruption, against the fact that there are no services, there are no prospects in Iraq for Iraqi youth, and that there are no sort of future prospects for them, tells you everything you need to know about how Iraqis feel. So we have to listen to that.
Abdulrazzaq, do you agree with that?
At some point, yeah, I agree. I think the main difference, I would say, about our perception or perspective from before and now for Iraqis, it's the hope. I mean, at least now there's hope. There is room for changing something, especially with this generation, the young generations, who they are thinking to regain the national identity that, as I said, we lost it in 2003. Before the invasion, there was no hope, because there was, when we lived there, we didn't see any way that, Saddam could be changed or replaced. I mean, unless there is a superpower like the U.S. and its coalitions had that capacity. But just back, one to your first questions about which one it's better off. I always ask myself, I mean, how about if the Iraqis could have ousted Saddam without foreign help, for example? I mean, wouldn't we have avoided really civil war? I mean, what happened was inevitable. I worked in Libya, for example, or when I was a UN employee, and I covered the transitional justice. I was in charge of justice in Libya. And Libya was not invaded by any foreign army. And there was no CPA, and there was no Bremer, and there was no governor. I know NATO helped when they bombed Gaddafi. But what happened in Libya is a civil war and collapsed state. So I think that maybe the vacuum happened when the dictator regime like Saddam or Gaddafi collapsed. I think what happened in Iraq, it's inevitable, because Iraq is still a complicated place. And there's no easy answer. I think we should not only blame the US and the poorly planned. And I think at the end, I think Iraqis deserve better than Saddam's regime and the poorly planned invasion.
Let's talk about this poorly planned invasion for a moment. Richard, if I can come to you, what was going through Tony Blair's mind, do you think, when he was proposing invading Iraq, given that Iraq had already, if you like, been let off from an invasion during the first Gulf War? The West only went so far as occupying Kuwait and then putting in place a series of no-fly zones. At what point do you think Tony Blair and George Bush looked at one another and said, yeah, you know what, we need to go all the way to Baghdad here?
Well, it was clearly at some point during 2002, and there's sort of quite a lot of controversy about exactly what was said in which meeting and when Blair really committed himself. But it is clear that there was a shift, at least by, I would say, mid-2002. I think what was going through Blair's mind was his belief that the world had fundamentally changed as a consequence of 9/11. And that it was going to be possible to not merely make interventions in specific countries, but really to kind of make a fundamental change to the whole world order, to make potentially a series of interventions, which in his view would assist the spread of democracy and human rights, which he was obviously, very, very over optimistic. And I would say that, of course, he put front and center in trying to sell this to the public, the notion of that Saddam had WMD. Yet I think what was really important in his mind was the belief that it was legitimate to get rid of Saddam Hussein, even if he didn't have WMD, and that issue was chosen really because it was thought to be most likely to persuade the UK public and UK politicians, because even when it turned out not to be true, then Blair continued to justify himself and in effect say, even had I known that WMD did not exist, I would still have favoured invasion. So I think WMD was always a bit of a red herring.
Do you think he was hoodwinked, if you like, by faulty intelligence, or do you think the UK at that stage genuinely believed that he did have WMD? If you're looking at it from the perspective of the British public, in the past without the benefit of hindsight, it was relatively easy for them to believe that Saddam might have weapons of mass destruction, because even if he didn't have nuclear weapons, they'd already faced information from the early 1990s with chemical weapons and biological weapons, which had actually been used at that time.
Yes, that's quite correct. So the fact that Saddam was an unpleasant tyrant who had used vile weapons in the past made this easier to believe. I think that in the case of the government, that although it may seem a funny way of putting it, there was a certain amount of wishful thinking that Saddam Hussein might have WMD, because then that would make it easier to legitimize the invasion. So I think that Blair was not somebody who was consciously lying, but somebody who took the weak and contradictory evidence and built it up in his own mind to try and persuade, in effect, himself and others that this was a sort of a good and reasonable thing to do.
Now, Abdulrazzaq, you mentioned in an earlier answer that you see a sort of slight difference in the comparison between Libya and Iraq, looking at Libya where there was an internal civil war fought by domestic parties, and the war in Iraq where, if you like, there was external regime change forced upon the people. But of course, in Iraq, there had been attempts at civil uprisings, in particular by the Marsh Arabs down in the south, for instance, all of which have been crushed by the regime. So how do you think Iraqis were hoping to respond? Were they hoping for regime change, or were they hoping to support the Saddam regime? And how do they feel about the current government?
After the Kurdish and Shia uprising, Intifada in 1921, and then when Saddam he used all the forces to crush these uprisings, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed and cities were damaged. By the way, still so far, there's tens of thousands of people are missing, since that Intifada, and dozens of mass graves. I think after that, Saddam was stronger and stronger, although he was under severe sanctions, international sanctions. But in fact, the sanctions impact on us as Iraqi people, not on the regime. And that's in 2001, even the US and the UK thought to change the sanction, and they used a new term, which is called the smart sanction. And then I asked one of the top US officials, said, after 2003, so do you think it was a stupid sanction? Then in order to change it to smart one. So in fact, to be honest, we had no hope that one day we will see Saddam out of his palace. You have no idea how much he was, how strong he was and how he supported. He had like hundreds of thousands of troops. They are really loyal to him. The Fidain Saddam, the Republican Guards, the Special Republican Guards, and other apparatus. And there was no real opposition in Iraq. There was no freedom. Do you know in 2003, when we were trying to know about what's going on in the world, we didn't have any access to internet. We didn't have any access to the foreign media or newspaper. We didn't have access to any satellite channels. It's the only the source for us to understand what's going on in the news. It's a radio, a transistor. So I'm telling you, this is the reality. It was impossible to get rid of Saddam without superpower from the US. So therefore, we waited. I know many Iraqis, we waited impatiently for that war because we think that's the only hope. We know the war. We were so anxious because we lived all our life now. But again, there is a huge difference what we hoped for and what we got. And as I told you, how we lost a lot, but also we gained something. At least now, it's a new generation. So we talk about, now about, it's not about this. Is it 20 years since the invasions? And as you know, the majority of the Iraqi population are young people. So the majority of the young people now they even don't remember Saddam. They even don't remember the complicity between the sectarian conflicts or what happened in the Intifada or something. And this is a new era, new technology. It's a new, and they had free election.
Let me bring it across and take it over to Oula. Oula, if we look at the costs of the war, between 275 and around 306,000 Iraqi civilians died of violence during the US invasion. The actual number of civilians killed by direct and indirect war violence is unknown, but it's probably much higher than that. In addition to that, there were nearly 4,500 Americans dead. The war cost the US $800 billion US. Those are figures from the US Treasury Department. Do you think, if you like, I hesitate to put it this way, but was it good value for money? Was the money spent well?
I won't be drawn into answering that kind of question. I mean, you're trying to put a price on human lives. I don't think you can really answer that question. I mean, you'll have to ask Iraqis inside the country whether it was worth it. Was it worth it for hundreds of thousands of Iraqis to die? Was it worth it for families to be fragmented, for the Iraqi nation to be divided, for there to be endemic violence as part of people's everyday life?
So what would you have wanted to see? What would you have wanted to see done differently?
That's also a difficult question. I mean, I think most of us wanted regime change, but we obviously didn't want it to occur on the back of a foreign intervention. I think it would have been very difficult for regime change to happen inside Iraq without some kind of assistance. But we didn't expect Iraq to undergo occupation and for this to turn into an imperial project. The way it was mishandled, the way that there was a lack of post-war planning showed not only arrogance on the part of the coalition, but a real disregard for Iraqi lives.
Bringing it across to you, Richard. The situation obviously also had a demonstrable impact on British politics. Up until this point, the British Prime Minister could more or less send the British Armed Forces wherever they liked. Now there has become, even though it's only been 20 years, this, if you like, tradition, even though it's a short tradition, that it has to be debated before Parliament. That's quite a significant change in UK politics, isn't it?
Yes, and this new convention has had real consequences. For example, in 2015, when bombing of Syria was discussed and debated in Parliament and rejected, so that was a real consequence. How fundamental the change is otherwise, one might question, insofar as one might in fact see the 2003 intervention not necessarily as a continuity or with a piece of previous British foreign policy, but you could see the Blair era as being rather exceptional in some ways, certainly in terms of the way that Labour governments have handled things. So that, for example, Britain did fight on the same side as the United States in the Korean War, but that was part of a UN-sanctioned war. In the 1960s, Harold Wilson skillfully kept Britain out of the Vietnam War. So the kind of enthusiasm, actually, with which Britain, or at least with the British government, went to war in Iraq in 2003 was really part of this project, which Blair was pushing much more broadly from the time of intervention in Sierra Leone in 1998 through Kosovo in 1999 through Afghanistan, which was in some respects actually unusual in British foreign policy, not because it was violent, which was relatively normal, but because it was conceived of not necessarily as being something that was done exclusively in British interests or in sort of the interests of power politics, but it was conceived, however, you may well say it was a misconceived, but it was conceived as a kind of idealistic intervention which was supposed to change the world. And that was something really which previous Conservative governments had not done. And indeed, previous Labour governments had not done either.
So has this ended, if you like, the neocon or the neoconservative project of the US and the UK and a few other Western friends going around the world and sort of asserting their will?
Well, certainly, I suppose you might say that the withdrawal from Afghanistan has been rather crucial here, and I think that how we judge the invasion in Iraq will depend over the long term whether or not the existing, admittedly very unsatisfactory pattern is maintained, or whether things get worse still. So I think that I wouldn't say it's necessarily put an end to these ideas, but it probably has put a damper on them and made them more difficult to execute for those who favour them.
Abdulrazzaq, Richard, Ola, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me today, agreeing to talk about this subject. Remember, you can see more debate and discussion over on our YouTube channel if you head over to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and all of the team, thank you for watching and goodbye.